In this episode.
And she looks at me, Lynn, and she pats me on the wrist. And she says, "You'll see, Dr. Morse. Heaven is fun." and this immediately captured my imagination because she was clinically dead. She wasn't hearing or seeing anything during this period of time. And yet, as she said herself, she said, "No, I wasn't dead. I wasn't dead at all. Some part of me was still alive."
Well, hello there. I'm Cool Gray, and this is Cool Gray in Studio A. Welcome back to the podcast. We're in season 3 and episode 19. I'm very glad you're here. We have an unbelievably fascinating conversation today with Dr. Melvin Morse. I will introduce you to him in just a moment, but there's something about this episode that requires a little bit of explanation. We had such a great conversation, not only about the subject at hand, which is near-death experiences in children, but about a number of other things as well. And our original recording went over 2 hours, and the rest of that content was so fascinating, there was just no way it belonged on the cutting room floor. So what I've done is created a special video exclusive bonus supplemental episode that you can find on my YouTube channel. Just check the show notes for the link, or you can go to Cool Gray Studios on YouTube and find the playlist for YouTube exclusive bonus content, and you will find the rest of the conversation. So you'll notice right after I introduce you to Dr. Morse, there'll be an odd kind of transition where I suddenly will say, "So before I take this plane into the Bermuda Triangle, let me come back to the topic at hand." That's kind of a jump where I've taken out part of our initial conversation and moved it into the supplement so that little weirdness makes sense to you. There was no way that I could kind of edit around it. So I just left it in there. In the meantime, let's get right to it because there's way too much amazing content for me to be blathering at you and keeping you from it. So here it is. My guest today is Melvin Morse. He's was an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Washington for 20 years. He's the author of several books, along with a science writer and documentary filmmaker, Paul Perry, about the science and spirituality of near-death experiences. His international bestseller, Closer to the Light, describes the near-death experiences of children and was based on his studies at Seattle Children's Hospital under the supervision of University of Washington's Human Subject Review Board. His latest book, Where God Lives, is an award-winning book discussing spiritual neuroscience and exactly how our brains are connected to the universe. Dr. Morse has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and won awards for his research on spiritual healing, remote viewing, and other aspects of human consciousness. Most recently, the Warcollier Prize for contributions to understanding human consciousness. He's also the co-director of the Recidivism Prevention Group, which successfully treats addicts and previously incarcerated offenders with meditation, yoga, and spiritual transformation. And that is such a rich field of things that we can talk about today. Dr. Morse, thank you for joining me. I'm very glad you're here.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
But before I let the plane go off into the Bermuda Triangle, let me come back to your study. What we were just talking about at Johns Hopkins, was that before or after the study that you're really best known for, which was the study of near-death experiences in children? Which came first?
I did my medical school training at Johns Hopkins, and I went to the University of California at San Francisco, and I did my senior residency and fellowships at the University of Washington in Seattle. And it was during this time I was working in a small hospital in Pocatello, Idaho, that really started my near-death research. But I think it's interesting that I happened to be at the right place in the right time, that I'd had my background, because certainly my background left me open to the idea of the dramatic events which I would learn, which are as follows. When I was in Pocatello, at this time, I'd mostly moved into pediatric intensive care unit medicine. I worked for Airlift Northwest, which was resuscitates critically ill children. And a young girl came in who had been underwater for 20 minutes.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, that's not impossible that she survived.
How old was she?
And she was 7 years old.
7.
And she had a very difficult and dramatic resuscitation. And I had told her parents that I thought that it was unlikely she would survive. We stabilized her. We got her, in this day and age, you can get anybody's heart and lungs functioning again. And we transferred her down to Primary Children's Hospital in Idaho, where she did, in fact, make a full recovery. And she happened to come back to Idaho. And in one of these things that, probably is not a coincidence, she just sort of coincidentally happened to be seeing another doctor at the clinic that I had been also working at. And she saw me in the hallway, and she said to her mother, "Oh, that's the doctor that put a tube in my nose." And I looked over at her and I said, "Crystal, I certainly remember you, but I doubt you remember me."
Oh, wow.
Because the time that that we had seen her in the emergency room, she was clinically dead. She was profoundly comatose. She wasn't seeing or hearing anything. I know that people often say, well, but couldn't they actually see, them waxing and waning consciousness?
Yeah, we're always reaching for some sensible explanation.
Well, we tape their eyes closed. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, no, I saw you put a tube in my nose." And she then went to describe her entire resuscitation. She said things like, "I saw you put me in a machine that looked like a donut," which was her description of a CAT scanner.
Right.
She said, "I heard you on the phone asking some other doctors what you were supposed to do next." She recounted comments, little comments that the nurses made. She then said that she, left her physical body and she went to a place that she perceived was heaven. And she saw the look on my face. I was like, "Oh, great."
I was just going to ask you, how were you responding standing there in that hallway?
I was like, "Oh, this is a little much for me." And she looks at me, Lynn, and she pats me on the wrist and she says, "You'll see, Dr. Morse. Heaven is fun." and this immediately captured my imagination because she was clinically dead. She wasn't hearing or seeing anything during this period of time. And yet, as she said herself, she said, "No, I wasn't dead. I wasn't dead at all. Some part of me was still alive."
And at her tender age, she was able to articulate that, which to me, it to me suggests that she brought something back with her in the form of wisdom, that it was beyond her earthly experience, but that's just me.
Yeah. It's common sense that if you nearly die, you think you're going to go to heaven. And I assume this is all just something that her mind just invented.
Mm.
And yet it was interesting that the experience that she described of going to heaven was not at all what she was taught. She came from a deeply religious Mormon family, and yet Crystal said that she crawled up a tunnel that was lined with bricks.
Oh.
This place she called heaven, and that she was met by a woman named Elizabeth. And Elizabeth said to her, "I'm here to help you." Well, none of that, obviously, but I did take, make sure, do my due diligence. I talked to the mom. I said,
"Is there an Elizabeth in her life?" Yeah.
Have you ever told her that, you crawl to heaven
Yeah.
and a tunnel lined with bricks? And she's like, "No,
No.
never said anything remotely like that."
What did the mother have to say when she heard this account?
They immediately believed her.
Wow.
Definitely had the ring of truth. And they also knew that she was clinically dead. I had told them to prepare themselves for her.
So was that experience the catalyst for the study?
Oh, absolutely. I was in an ideal position to study these experiences. That really very little had been written about them in the scientific or medical literature. There was case collections, and such as that. But and of course, my brother-in-law Raymond Moody had done a study of adults. But these were adults that came up to him after lectures and things like that and told him of their experiences of going, having near-death experiences and going. But it's not truly a study in the sense that I was in the intensive care unit at Seattle Children's Hospital. I was working with the head of the intensive care unit and the head of the Department of Neurology. We actually thought that we were going to be able to show that these experiences were caused by medications or perhaps a lack of oxygen to the brain. But we were resuscitating critically ill children on a regular basis. And we determined that we would study every survivor of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital over a 15-year period of time. So that's very different than the previous studies, and frankly, most of the studies that have come after us.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't, you couldn't volunteer to be in our study. We didn't alert to anybody, our research subjects, that we were studying near-death experiences or even the events surrounding death and dying.
They didn't know that they weren't prompted, is what you're saying, right?
We titled our study the psychological effects of surviving an intensive care unit experience. And so, when we went out to the families' homes and we explained the study, we in no way tipped our hand that we were interested in these experiences. Mm-hmm. And we also studied control patients. In other words, by control patients, I mean patients who also had a lack of oxygen to their brain, who also were treated with a variety of different medications, who also were in the scary pediatric intensive care unit, and most of them also thought they were going to die. You take the average, 5-year-old child, and they survive an intensive care unit experience, they think that they're going to die.
So the controlled group had a lack of oxygen, but they were never clinically deceased at any point?
Never clinically dead.
Okay. That's
the only difference between our control patients and the patients that we studied.
And so with both groups combined, how many, over a 15-year period, how many total participants were in that study?
Well, unlike what you see on TV, it's actually fairly rare to survive cardiac arrest. Uh-huh. Particularly if you're a child, the types of situations that lead to this, near drownings, accidents.
Yeah, that's got to be the hardest part of your job as a doctor.
It's brutal.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also my motivation, Lynn, for sharing, what we learned from our study. Because we studied actually 26 survivors of cardiac arrest. And to our astonishment, 24 of them described the near-death experience. And this was completely unanticipated, that most of these children hadn't even told their parents of the experience. Yeah. The head psychiatrist at Seattle Children's Hospital, when I told him of our study, he said, well, you're not going to hear anything. He said, I'm the psychiatrist. I work with these patients closely. If they were having near-death experiences, I'm sure I would have heard of it. But in fact, they.
So what do you think was different? What do you think was different than where, if you're saying they were not prompted, what was different about your conversations than the ones they were having with the psychiatrist where they did actually disclose this?
Well, we actually asked them, do you remember about, the time you were in the hospital?
Okay.
What do you remember about,
Mm-hmm.
So we took the trouble to ask them. Mm-hmm. But I did, one little girl, she drew me quite a dramatic picture of her resuscitation. But I did say to her, I said, well, why did you tell your parents, or haven't you told anybody about this experience? And she looked at me and she sort of whispered and she said, I didn't think you were supposed to be able to talk to God. Oh. So at her age, she knew. If you can I show you a picture? Is that possible with this?
You can, yeah. Can you do a screen share?
Yeah.
Then for those who listen on audio, I'll just ask you to email that image to me if you can, and I'll include it in the blog that will accompany this episode.
This picture here, I think, really illustrates the child's near-death experience. You can see down in the lower left corner, she's drawing herself on a gurney, and she's drawing her own resuscitation. The figure with his hands on her is my partner, Dr. Christopher, and he has his hands, she's drawn his hands and his arms in perfect American Heart Association.
Which I presume she hadn't been through that certification course.
Right, yeah, perfect. She perfectly draws exactly how to resuscitate a patient. And at the head of the gurney, she draws a figure who's wearing a hat. And so that's not something you're going to see on TV or in any, but that is in fact correct. The head of the team of our resuscitation teams always wore a hat so that they would be instantly identifiable,
as the team lead. Oh, wow.
Of resuscitation. She then draws herself rising out of her physical body, and she there's so many odd aspects to these experiences. I know that, well, common sense, we thought, so I can't pick on other people, but I think it's commonly thought, well, this is just some sort of invention of their mind. We've all heard about heaven from, and she's taught about heaven in Sunday school. So it must just be that. She's just, sort of filling in the blanks of a memory gap. But that's not what she describes at all. She rises out of her physical body, and then she sees Jesus, and Jesus is sitting on a log, according to her.
That's not in the Bible anywhere.
Right. Well, again, you're not going to, that little detail is, is not taught in Sunday school.
And just that it has that level of detail makes it compelling.
And there's a rainbow up in the top left-hand corner. And she said that this was a light that told her who she was and where she was to go. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, she draws a door and with some figures there. And I asked her what that was. And she said those were grandpas and grandmas and babies waiting to be born. And interestingly enough, there's no sense of reincarnation or anything like that. This is a Lutheran family,
right?
And there's no reincarnation in their family beliefs. So it has. She's able to draw aspects of her own resuscitation that she shouldn't know about, and then she draws this very spiritual journey. She said that this figure that was sitting on a log told her that it wasn't her time to die. And so she was returned to her body.
And that's very common in the near-death experience. I know in adults that
yes, children as well.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like an instruction to go back, and sometimes it's a choice that's given.
Sometimes it seems like a choice, which can be challenging, I think, to, because often then parents wonder, well, why didn't my child choose to return? But very frequently it's not. I had one young man, and he did not want to leave this heavenly environment. And so he describes himself as being kicked out of heaven. Yeah. He said he would go back.
This was a juvenile?
Yeah, this is a young teen.
So, and I know that with adult NDEs, just the little bit that I know, that's also very common, that they say the feeling that they had there felt more like home than anywhere they'd ever been, and that it was so blissful, so full of permeating love that they didn't want to come back, and they had to be encouraged. So yeah, that's got to be an interesting moment.
That has not been experienced in this life.
Right. So,
and they come back with a specific message. And I think this touches on what you were talking about earlier, was that they feel very strongly that they're here in this life for a specific purpose.
For a purpose.
And they're here to learn lessons of love.
I mean, that kind of seems to follow logically, because why come back if you're done? Obviously there's a sense of unfinished business even at the childhood level, and what you're suggesting is that's not generated in the brain of the child, that's coming from elsewhere, and that of course is what makes the topic so mysterious and fascinating.
And we heard this, I mean, it was astonishing, because we really, I'd worked in the intensive care unit, of course, for years, and had never heard these kinds of experiences. But like I told you before, nobody had ever actually gone out and interviewed these children.
So how many of you were actively working on this study over this 15-year period?
Well, I would say usually we had 3 or 4 medical students. And then my senior Dr. Tyler was head of the intensive care unit. Dr. Jerry Milstein was head of the Department of Neurology. And then, I was the primary researcher. I was a fellow at the time.
Right.
So I, 7 or 8 of us.
So you must have been having regular status meetings. And as this study is unfolding, tell me about some of those conference room moments. And as you were making these amazing discoveries and you saw the trajectory, it sounds to me like your hypothesis going in was not this. And as these stories began to emerge, how was a medical team responding?
The medical students had, I think, the best sort of understanding of it. And they really had no trouble picking up the idea that, as time went by and none of our control patients ever described any sort of experience, and yet patient after patient that survived cardiac arrest was telling us, things like, I'm not afraid to die because I know a little bit more about it now. Or one young girl, she said, during the time she was resuscitated, she said that her grandmother was sitting there. And she said, I was just so shocked to see her.
She understood, yeah.
And then she says to us, and then I was back. Actually, I think the medical student was interviewing her, and he said, what do you mean by that? And she sort of clenched her fists, and she said, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Wow.
And I think that summarizes the point of view of the team. Yeah. I think that is, in fact, what we were trying to figure out. The senior members of the team, they were open-minded enough to embrace the study, to have this study done. But it just, from the head of, the Department of Neurology, this doesn't fit with any of, our preconceived notions.
Right. And that's why I asked the question, because I know that this study was published, did receive accolades. I believe some of the things you just described to me were, wasn't it captured for a television program or was it, what was it? Was it a news program or like a?
Well, we had, 2020 did a segment.
That's what it was. Yeah. With the girl drawing the picture. Is that what that's from?
Life magazine.
Right.
But we published our study in the American Medical Association's pediatric journals.
Right. So it was embraced enough by the people that you were reporting to, that it wasn't, I guess, me watching too much television, there's always the temptation to squash it because it doesn't fit the narrative, so that you didn't encounter any of that kind of resistance.
We encountered that resistance from ourselves, but our study was just too well done. We had meticulously designed our study. And so I think that there was no question in our mind it would eventually be published and by one of the best medical journals that there is.
Yeah.
Because the study itself was so well done. But the results are extremely challenging. And as yet, we still do not have some sort of a scientific or medical model to explain how profoundly comatose patients whose brains aren't working are having experiences of of their personality, of surviving bodily death, of accurately describing their own surroundings, and then giving all these strikingly similar experiences of seeing a loving light when they die, a light that one child said to me, it was a light that has a lot of good things in it. So our study, though, was followed up. Fortunately, one study doesn't mean anything. Pin van Lommel, who's a Dutch cardiologist, followed up our study with a very similar study of adults, in which he again interviewed survivors of cardiac arrest. So we call that a prospective study, which is sort of the gold standard of this sort of study,
right,
in which we interview survivors of cardiac arrest. And sure enough, he discovered that adults, as compared to his control patients, also described these types of experiences.
Yeah.
And his study published in the Lancet. But there's realistically, Lynn, we have had many revolutions in scientific thinking, paradigm shifts, and paradigm shifts don't occur until, frankly, the old guard dies off. Until it'll be our medical students. Once they become the heads of departments, once they become chairmen of teaching hospitals, et cetera.
Right. That's how you break down those barriers. You wait for that generation to pass and make way for the new.
But right now, we're in a paradigm shift, and it's very hard for those in the shift to know what is going to be seen at the end. To give you an example of how well our findings are accepted, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a professor emeritus at psychiatry at the University of Virginia, he described near-death research as a freight train that is bearing down and about to destroy our current understanding of the nature of consciousness.
And we mean that in a good way.
Yeah. Oh, right. Well,
sometimes destruction can be exactly what's needed to give birth to the new.
This understanding of consciousness, right now, we have a very mechanical view of human consciousness. And this new understanding of consciousness is, frankly, a spiritual one. This is in lockstep, for example, with the new findings in physics. The new physics, which is not new, it's been around for about 100 years. Again, all of the new theoretical physicists who've been discovering the nature of reality are writing books about spirituality in their part-time.
And I think that's fascinating, because if we actually go back in time, hundreds and hundreds of years, science didn't come on the scene really in the way that it's regarded today as being like, we need to be able to prove things through the scientific method. That's a relatively new concept when you talk about, the timeline of human existence. It used to be, medicine people in the village that knew about herbs and other kinds of compounds, and then things kind of progressed a little bit from there. And a lot of our cultural concepts about what we needed to do for our own well-being was coming out of, I think, a very spiritual, but a very naturopathic kind of way. Then science comes on the scene, and we made this grand shift, and that became God to a lot of people, to the point where there's now this tension between, you're going to have to make a choice. You're either going to take the faith approach or you're going to take the science approach, and never the twain shall meet. And it feels like in recent years, that's been kind of breaking down for any number of reasons. Some of them because the place where the conflict happens is that, look, I can't explain that thing. I can't explain that near-death experience by the scientific method, which just means I haven't figured it out that way yet. But it doesn't mean we can't look at it. The whole job of science is to explain the stuff that we don't understand yet. So we have to be able to entertain those things. And just because we haven't achieved the answer yet doesn't mean that this is now something that can't be talked about or can't be acknowledged as happening, as reality. And now that seems to be coming back together, like the pendulum is swinging back. Is that your feeling?
I think it's important to understand that almost every area of science that you look at, whether you're looking at theoretical physics, whether you're looking at evolutionary biology, or you're, these new findings in consciousness that we're finding in the near-death experience, they are all pointing to this concept of consciousness being independent of brain function. We've actually discovered now that the human brain has specific areas and pathways which seem to allow us to have spiritual experiences and allow us to connect with what these children sort of, commonly call God. I hear people say, or commonly or on Facebook, they say, well, science doesn't believe in the near-death experience. That's absolutely not true.
Right. Well, you're living proof. You're sitting right here, a scientist telling me otherwise.
The essence of science is observation. And, so it's first, what are our observations? And then, as you point out, it's creating hypotheses and testing those hypotheses to explain our observations. But the observations that the process of dying, you become more conscious, more awake, more aware than we are.
And that's what ends up creating a lot of tension, because we have to reconcile that. Those who are listening to this or hearing about these experiences, now we have to, first of all, if you're a scientist, you may have to measure that against what you've been taught about scientific method, or what you've been taught is real and true and correct, and where that exists. Or if you're not a scientist and you're someone like me or anybody else, you have to reconcile that with your current set of beliefs, whether they be from your religious or cultural upbringing, or, just your own efforts of trying to make sense out of this. Once you get to the point where you've got this collection of data that says everybody who has a near-death experience reports something that appears to be very spiritual in nature. And that word is just, it's such a hot button. And I think we need to get around that, because what we're talking about when we say spiritual is what we're talking just about the very essence of consciousness. And that's, and that in and of itself is spiritual, because it's not corporal, so.
That's why I love talking to children, because they'll just say things like, it was God.
Yes.
Or we interviewed a young man who dug a tunnel in beach sand, and then the tunnel collapsed on him and suffocated him.
That was a bad idea.
He did initially tell me that he was approached by a wizard dressed in white, and the wizard said to him, "Struggle and you shall live." However, after telling this experience to his parents and such as that, he then later, when I interviewed him in follow-up, he told me that he realized that this wizard was actually Jesus Christ. So I think that there's something that comes to us when we die. And, if I think he was 11, if you're a young boy who's fascinated with Dungeons and Dragons,
you're going to see a wizard. Right.
I think that we'll often interpret it, according to our own. But
Yeah.
Lynn, I want to stop just for a moment here. Before we speculate, on the shifting paradigm and what science will eventually tell us about, these near-death experiences and the nature of consciousness. Here's what we do know. Here's the science of near-death experiences in 2023. We know that we will all have this experience when we die. We know that the process of dying is that you're conscious and alert and aware, and that awareness that comes right in the last few seconds of life. So,
regardless of the manner of death, you're suggesting.
That's what I'm saying. They've done experimental studies in which they've experimentally induced near-death experiences.
I saw movies about that in the 80s.
Military studies.
Yeah.
But they show the exact same thing. They show that these fighter pilots who they subjected to a near-death type of experiences, they were completely comatose. They had no consciousness. And then right when they come to the point in which they think, when the blood has stopped flowing in their brain, and if they don't stop the experiment, they're going to die, those fighter pilots then regain consciousness and had a sense of being out of their physical body, etc. And this exactly matches what we discovered in children. By and large, for example, one girl that we resuscitated, she had a cardiac arrest, and we had to put a needle in her heart to restart it. That's near death. And she said she didn't remember anything about being in the hospital. She didn't remember anything about the intensive care unit, which fits with neurology as we know it. That we lose our short-term memory with trauma. But she says at that very moment that we knew we were resuscitating her, she said, "Suddenly I was awake and I heard you calling for that crash cart thing." And, and that's when she had her experience. And then she went back into unconsciousness again once she was resuscitated. So this is all the different ways we know that the process of dying, you become awake and aware. And by and large, you're aware of some sort of wonderful sense of love, of unconditional love. And at least for children, they don't die alone. There invariably is some sort of a helper, or like I told you with Crystal, she said that there was a woman named Elizabeth there who told her that she was there to help her. We resuscitated one young girl who, this is back, before they had GFI switches. She electrocuted herself when she was in the bathtub listening to a radio. She told me that throughout her very difficult resuscitation, there was a woman that she called a nurse. She said, "I was just so grateful that nurse was there to hold my hand the whole time that you were doing it." We didn't actually have a nurse holding her hand, but but that's her helper. I want to share this, with parents who are suffering the loss of a child, or certainly we know from the adult world that, even if somebody that you love or somebody who has died in the most extreme circumstances, they do not die alone, as you would fear.
That's actually something I mentioned to you before we started recording, that I have a very a little too much experience with loss in my family. Between my husband and I, we've lost an extraordinary number of people for various reasons, and that I spent some time as a grief counselor. And so death and dying is an area of interest to me for those reasons. And I've spoken to some hospice nurses. That's another area here where they have an opportunity to observe a population of people. We're there with our loved one. They're there with everybody's loved ones every single day. And they're seeing these experiences over and over. And there are some correlations between what you're describing and the beginning of the dying process and the deathbed visions that people have and the visitations that they say. I know my own dad, I lost him 2 years ago. And when he was home on hospice care in his last couple of weeks, there was a day that he said to my mom, "What are all these people doing here?" And she said, what people? He said, "Well, they're out there in the living room, but there's some of them are in here too." He said, "But they're dark." He said they were like silhouettes, is what he described. And she said, "Well, are they saying anything?" And he said, "No." And then he said, and then he kind of caught himself because she was asking the questions. It seemed to alert him to the fact that she wasn't seeing what he was seeing. And then he rationalized and said, "Those are probably just floaters in my eyes." But he also talked about receiving a phone call from a relative that he hadn't spoken to in a long time, that he was feeling guilty about. So all these kind of moments of reconciliation were happening for him. Like he was regretting that he hadn't been in touch with this cousin. So they were able to have a phone call, whether that was in a dream or some other way. He managed to tie up that little loose end for himself. But I know that often people who are in the dying process will have these visits, and they're usually from known loved ones who have already passed. That seems to be very common. That my dad saw silhouettes and lots of them and could not identify any of them kind of troubles me. It makes me wonder what was going on there, and will we ever know? But it is fascinating because that is also near death. You're talking about somebody who died and came back. We're talking about somebody who is dying and not coming back. But there's that moment that intersects that has a lot of correlation. And I just think I think it's irresponsible and lazy to say, "Oh, that's some neurological function of the brain, or that's some sort of chemical reaction." What are you basing that on? It sounds to me like you almost set out to try to prove that and didn't. Your study took you in an entirely different area.
So we know, for example, that the near-death experience is not a hallucination at the point of death. It's not some sort of dream. It's not some sort of neurochemical dysfunction. In fact, there are specific areas of the brain which seem to start to function, perhaps for the first time in people's lives, and function normally, that permit this experience to occur. And you have really hit on something that I feel very passionate about, that once we understand that the near-death experience is real, then we understand that this whole range of associated experiences, premonitions of death, shared dying experiences, after-death communications, the reports that the dying have, that all of those things become validated as well.
Mm-hmm.
This can then, I think, lead to a revolution in the way we treat death and dying. Because right now, mostly time motion studies of hospitals show that when patients are dying, doctors spend less time with them, nurses spend less time with them, and they even get fewer visits from relatives and loved ones, because it's hard to know.
Because medical science is kind of at the end of its rope. There's nothing more that can be done.
We know. That's a very important time.
Yes.
To learn, from the dying themselves.
Right.
That they still have something to share with us.
Right.
I think that hopefully the old deathbed scene where people actually crowd in on the dying patient.
Yeah. And I know I've been through that personally, because I've carried the feeling in me that no one should die alone. And I know that I sat with my husband's mother when she was passing away in a nursing home. I sat with her around the clock for 3 days. I pulled up a reclining chair and I put a blanket and a pillow and held her hand after she stopped responding. Once she was still and her eyes were closed and she couldn't squeeze my hand when I asked her to anymore. And to me, that means she's unconscious and she's no longer aware of what's going on around her. But there's a part of me that said, but I don't want her to feel alone. And for me, I sat there and held her hand until she took her last breath. And when my dad passed away, he was actually back in the hospice facility when he died. The nurses said to us, because we were there for 3 days, my sisters and my brother and my mom and I, and we would take turns going into the room. So he was not alone for a moment, even though he wasn't responding anymore to us. And the staff said to us, very often they'll wait until you go home. They don't want you to be here when they actually make that transition. And that is in fact what happened. We finally went home overnight, and first thing in the morning, we got the call that he had passed. And I remember going, well, how the heck do they know what he wants? He can't tell them, but they'd seen it over and over and over and over.
So this brings up a really important practical aspect of this, is that death is not to be feared and dying is not to be feared. Well, right now in the United States, we spend billions of dollars on the final moments of life with unnecessary medical care, which is frankly dehumanizing. Only separates the dying from their loved ones. And this is medical care that does not prolong life in any
Are you talking about traditional hospice care, or are you talking about something else?
No, I'm talking about, most patients die in hospitals.
Right.
Still. We don't have a robust hospice system. And most patients die, hooked up to machines, that as I did for a living, we try to resuscitate them. We intubate
or you keep them on a ventilator for God knows how long. Yeah.
And that type of medical care is really superstitious. And we do it, frankly, because we can, and because, doctors think that patients want it. Patients think that doctors want it. And really, nobody wants to talk about it.
And family members, I think, aren't ready to let go.
Exactly. We don't really talk about death and dying. And so as a result of not talking about death and dying, we don't have good discussions of what type of end of life care we would like.
Right.
And then that extremely expensive and dehumanizing form of care that's currently routine. And if we embraced and internalized this idea that the dying process is spiritually dynamic, that patients, they have something to teach us, perhaps that could catalyze a greater discussion of death and dying and lead to a more humane way of dying.
There's a hospice nurse who is on TikTok, and she's regularly talking about end-of-life experiences for purposes of educating people and kind of demystifying and taking the stigma away. What she's doing is amazing. She even shows little videos sometimes of people in the midst of having these, the restlessness that comes along at end of life, or the visions that they're having. And she's like, you need to look at this and you need to see this so that when you experience it with someone you love, it's not going to be something that you don't know how to cope with, that you already understand that this is part of the experience. And one of the things that she was lamenting was the use of morphine and other medications in order to make that go away. You see your loved one struggling and suffering because their systems are shutting down and you want them to not suffer. So please, more morphine, more morphine. And what she's saying is, what a shame that it's going to rob that dying person of awareness because they've been drugged and they're not experiencing whatever you want to call it, God, the universe, whatever your nomenclature is, whatever they're supposed to be experiencing in its fullness in that moment is being taken away from them. I will tell you honestly, I'm conflicted on that, because I'm all about, hey, as soon as they offer you the morphine option, I'm telling you right now, bring it on, because I don't want to struggle and I don't want to suffer, but I'm kind of reevaluating that now,
Realistically, morphine at the point of death is not necessarily only about pain control. It's often too, in fact,
accelerate the process, right? Because
patients are thought to be hallucinating. Patients are thought to be talking crazy,
yeah,
to suppress that, etc. I think that if morphine was only used for pain control, that would be great. But morphine is overused
right.
In the process of dying, and so I'm not conflicted about it at all. I think if we just focused on pain control and did not otherwise fear the dying process, and in fact embraced it as something worth listening to and learning from, we would see a lot less of the over-medication of dying patients.
Yeah, interesting. I know that your life took a trajectory as a result of this study that took you to places that most medical professionals don't ever have an opportunity to go. In terms of expanding your awareness of things that are greater than us and all of the spiritual implications. And again, I almost don't even like the word spiritual because it seems to imply religious, and that is not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying bigger than the corporal, bigger than the things we can experience with the five senses, because I think we have more senses than that. I'd like to know how your life has changed and how you have changed as a person as a result of what you've experienced and learned with these studies.
Certainly, it's made me a lot more humble. Certainly, it's taught me to be much more forgiving of myself and others because of this. It's a scientific fact. We're here to learn lessons of love. I like to put it in those sort of hyperbole
Stop and break that down, because you made a statement of truth. We know, or this is fact. Can you expand on that? Expand on that. I want to give you the opportunity to expand on that.
That's a little bit of hyperbole, but not too much. We know that the near-death experience is real. I was inspired to do the rest of the studies that I've done on on spirituality and spiritual healing and remote viewing and such as that, because a young man said to me, he said, "But was my experience real? Because if it was real, you've got to tell all the old people." So that issue, I think it's now, I think it's generally accepted that the near-death experience is real among scientists who are familiar with the literature. Those are two big caveats.
Right.
So if the experience is real, then what do they tell us, these people that have come to the point of death? Invariably, they say that this life is like a school, or that this life is here to learn something, and primarily to learn lessons of love. So, I think that we should take them at their word.
So lessons of love, meaning?
I think that almost everything we struggle with is a lesson of love. You've suffered a lot of loss in your life.
Mm-hmm.
That ultimately is a lesson of love.
One of the things I used to teach, because I was taught about grief, is that the experience of grief is evidence of love. The reason we grieve is because we loved.
I have the typical personality of an intensive care unit doctor, meaning that I'm short-tempered and think I'm smarter than everybody, etc. And that leads then to lessons of love of how to be a good parent.
So lessons of love, how to love better, how to perfect the act of loving. And a lot of people, reading the Bible, what does it tell us about God? God equals love. So whatever the highest entity is, whatever label you want to put on, and I want to be careful not to impose a belief on a listener, but whatever you experience as the highest level that can be achieved, it seems almost universal, regardless of where you picked up your belief system from, that the thing we're all aspiring to is love, and loving in the most perfect way that's possible for us.
Sure, but mostly, Lynn, we're failing in our lessons of love.
Yes.
And then we feel guilty about it.
Yes.
Or we feel inadequate. This life is difficult. At least for me, it's enormously reassuring to know that no matter how badly you screw up your life, you're going to get a big hug from what kids call God. I love talking to kids because they don't have these conflicts that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to get an attaboy. You're going to say you did your best. Even Nazi prison guards describe near-death experiences in which
That is fascinating. There's I think we talked about this in our pre-interview. There's another neurologist who I wish I could remember his name now. You knew it, who was famous for his own personal near-death experience and where he's gone with it from there. And he describes a transitional moment before he emerged into this heaven-like area, where he said it was like being underground. He said he felt like a worm in the earth and everything sounded muted, and it was very unsettling, and he couldn't find his way out. There was this period that he said he feels like he went to hell before he got to heaven. Yeah. I imagine you wouldn't hear anything like that from children because they haven't been around long enough to have conjured any bad mojo for themselves.
You're, of course, talking about Evan Alexander.
Evan, yes. Uh-huh.
His story is compelling because he's a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon.
And very controversial.
The last person that you would think would embrace a near-death experience. Yeah. And yet, he had a near-death experience, as you described. Mm-hmm. So many times these experiences contain their own sense of validation. In his experience, he encountered a woman that he knew was his sister, and yet he didn't know that he had a sister.
He'd never met her, right? He wasn't even aware that he had a sister. That's right. That's right. Fascinating story. And his life went on a whole other trajectory as well.
The near-death experience clearly teaches us that we're on a personal journey, that our personal journey probably doesn't make sense to others. It may not, apply to others because they're not learning the same lessons that we are. And certainly we have the ability to have these types of experiences that we can personally interpret for ourselves.
That near-death experience, the report when they tell us about them is that they went somewhere, but did they? My individual consciousness, is it an individual thing with hard boundaries, or is it a part of a unified field of consciousness, which is a scientific term?
Well, this is why it's great to go back to science. Mm-hmm. If you understand the science of it all, we know that everything that we perceive as reality is actually a mental model created by our brain. And that's not from, near-death research. That's from Neuroscience 101.
Uh-huh. And it's great when they all agree with each other.
Yeah. So the nature of reality, again, science tells us, is that it's a electromagnetic field in which time and space are concepts which are only created by the human brain, or I suppose by other brains as well, but not an independent part of reality. Right. So the science teaches us that we are, in fact, part of everything else. And so the physicists call that entanglement. And they've been able to show that we're entangled with the atoms of the stars. That, so every aspect of our reality is enmeshed in every aspect of reality. Again, that's the science of it. And yet we seem to have an individual sense of consciousness. And that individual sense of consciousness is what we use then to interact with each other and learn our lessons, and, et cetera.
Does the science, or do you personally, you can answer this either way, support the idea that our individual consciousnesses come together somewhere, and that our individual experiences are somehow benefiting or adding to a greater whole? Or is that not what the science is telling us?
I don't think that science is there yet. And I don't actually have an opinion on that. Mm-hmm. I think that, we'll know that when we die. Yeah. We'll know that probably when we're
I've said that before on this program. There'll come a day when I'm not here anymore, wherever I am headed next, where I'll finally say, okay, that is what was going on. Won't know until I get there.
Yeah. And, we know that most of these things that we think about reality, we get wrong anyway. Yeah. I mean, ordinary things about reality we typically get wrong. But I have to tell you, I'm always drawn back to what children tell me.
Sure.
And
Yes, there's a
this
purity.
this issue of being whether we're out of our bodies, etc. This one boy, he looked at me with wonder and he said, "It was kind of like I was leaving my body, but it was kind of like I was walking into my mind."
Oh, that's beautiful.
I think that
I
I don't
love
think
that. I
more
love
than
that.
I didn't, because remember, the body itself is a mental construct. There's no body to actually leave. This is all, and then that's again, to understand the near-death experience, you have to understand the science, the neuroscience, and neuroscience teaches us that we create this reality. That this is and even your reality is very different than mine. We've just mutually decided on how to define it. For example, the color red. Our parents teach us for hours and hours and hours when we're 2 years old. That's red. That's red.
Yeah.
That wavelength of light is red. That experience that you're having is red. And that's, in my opinion, why there's so much confusion about the near-death experience, because we don't have that same shared appreciation of what it all means. We haven't spent hours and hours and hours saying that's a piece of grass.
And I think that might be because we don't have a way to describe it. We don't have the language.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
But people then often take that to mean, well, then it can't be real. I mean, because
and that's the shame of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I will meet you in the Cosmic Cafe on the other side, and we'll put our heads together and see how right you were, how right I was, how wrong we both were. I want to give you just a moment to talk about the Recidivism Prevention Group. Is that work that you're currently doing right now? And how do some of these concepts integrate into what you're doing there with those people? What's that program about?
We were derailed, of course, by COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I think like everybody else.
Right.
So we're just starting again. But I was inspired by the transformation that we see in the near-death experience. After I did my study of children who had near-death experiences, our team then studied adults who had near-death experiences as children. And we carefully, again, compared them to various control groups.
Oh, that's interesting.
People that had, were in car accidents, but, didn't have a spiritual experience, people that, had no spiritual experiences at all, people who had spiritual experiences, but were never near death. And we found that the survivors of childhood near-death experiences caused a profound transformation in their personalities, which I think can be summed up as they just were really nice people. I think that's they tended to give more money to charity and, et cetera. And, this understanding that we have an area of the brain that can facilitate this transformation then stimulated me to start working with the ex-incarcerated and particularly with heroin addiction. I think that spiritual solutions are necessary. And again, like you have alluded to earlier, unfortunately, when you say things like spiritual solutions, you think that,
we're going to ram some kind of doctrine down their throats. And,
right. That's not it at all.
Yeah.
Just teaching meditation and just teaching, we work entirely with men, just teaching them that the answers can be found within. And through the process, often simply of meditation or of yoga, that those can be used as tools for spiritual transformation. And once that spiritual transformation occurs, then, the craving of heroin, or I always see politicians talking about, well, we got to lock up all these rapists and murderers. Actually, most people are in prison because they steal to support their heroin habit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what that's what mass incarceration really is.
Right.
You're really just locking up a bunch of people that they can't afford their drugs.
Yeah.
Once they start to understand that, then all the layers of shame and the sense of that they're failures and that they can't possibly survive in society, etc., just wash away.
Is this a court-appointed or prescribed program, or how do people find you? Is it voluntary?
So far, we have just worked with voluntary, and we've just, we've written up our success rate for the medical literature and such as that. But, like I said, we got derailed by COVID, and so we have not yet found our stride. Eventually, I'd like to work, like you said, with, court-appointed
Yeah,
programs.
that's a great way to get, because it seems to me that if you're addicted to heroin, your chances of seeking out a program like this and voluntarily submitting to it is pretty slim.
Well, this is the kind of thing where we have to just keep working at it, and just case by case by case until we have enough that then somebody will take a chance on us, and sponsor us for
has such wonderful potential. So is that your primary focus right now, or what else are you doing at the moment?
My focus right now is working with the ex-incarcerated and the practical aspects, I guess, of the near-death experience. I studied that experience of our near-death experiences are real. They are real. I think that it has applications for spiritual healing. It has applications for, I think, remote viewing and such as that. The fact that we can remote view, I think, shows, that aspects of the near-death experience must be real.
Right.
But I've satisfied that, at least to my own satisfaction. I think now, the practical aspects, what can we learn from these experiences? How can we be better human beings because of it?
Anyone who's interested in your recidivism prevention program, that would be local to the South Carolina area, or
work with anybody.
Is there an online capability there, or like a virtual participation option?
We already have, I have 3 guys that I work with. We already have more than we can work with, but I have a website, Melvin Morse MD, as one long word.com.
I'll link to that in the show notes.
Anybody who's interested in this, just email me through our website.
Wonderful.
Routinely work with people remotely as well.
And your books, are they available in bookstores and on Amazon, or do you sell them through your website? What's the best way to get our hands on those?
And my books are in your local library. You don't have to.
You're not a huckster.
You can find them on Amazon, etc. But I mean, even in rural South Carolina, where I live, the local libraries, because this research is so solid. When people are struggling to understand the near-death experience and are they real and does science support them, it's because they simply haven't done enough research yet.
What if I want an autographed copy of Closer to the Light?
Oh, I'd be happy to give you one. And anybody that, if the people really want that sort of thing, sure, email me through. Actually, I think I sell them on my website. I sell some autographed copies.
Very nice.
We're trying to raise money for our recidivism.
There you go. Very good. Thanks for that. Anything else you want people to know about you, your work, or how to connect with you if they're interested in knowing more?
I do want to share something with people. I'm on various Facebook groups, and, I'm sort of aware what people, struggle with. It breaks my heart when people share the most astonishing spiritual experiences, things that can really transform their lives. And then they'll go, but it must have just been some kind of crazy dream. Or, science just says, I talked to some, it's never a scientist who I'm familiar with who actually, is familiar in the field. It's always, I talked to my brother-in-law who's a pathologist, at my local hospital, and he said that science just says there's nothing to it. That's not true. These experiences are real. By and large, the spiritual experiences that you have are real. I would pay attention to them. I would listen to them carefully. You're not crazy for having them. And I think if you're struggling with the loss of, my particular interest is in grieving parents, know that your child did not die alone, and know that there's some meaning to the death of your child, even that horrific, meaningless experience, that there is, in fact, some meaning to it. And, that's primarily the reason that I continue to be on podcasts, is because I think I was blessed to be at the right place at the right time, to have been able to study so many survivors of cardiac arrest, to have learned that these experiences are real. And I want to share that with other people.
Yeah, it's greater than just understanding what's happening in that moment. There's so much comfort and reassurance available to those of us who are left behind. And that's a beautiful thing that you're doing. Thank you. That's a perfect way to bring this conversation to a very smooth landing. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for joining me today. It's been a great time. I've learned so much, and I realize that I want to learn more. So I might be looking for those books in the near future. And I would just encourage anybody else to reach out for more. I'm always telling people to use that brain, just exercise it, stretch it, see how much more you can pack in there without your head exploding. So thanks for being a part of that today. And I hope we have a chance to talk again.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
If you want to go listen to the supplemental episode on my YouTube channel, you will hear us talk about things like split brain surgery and its effects on consciousness. And if you don't know what that is, head over there and listen. We're also going to talk about functional neurogenesis, which is the concept that every thought and every experience we have actually alters the physiology of our brains. So he's going to talk about that. He's just the guy to do it. And then we're also going to talk about the nature of memory. What is it and where is it stored? Another fascinating conversation. And finally, we're going to talk about Dr. Morse's most recent book, which is called Where God Lives. And in that book, he talks about a concept called spiritual neuroscience, which he sort of alluded to a little bit in this conversation. I hope you'll come over to YouTube and listen to the rest of the content. It's about 25 minutes worth of additional bonus material, and you'll get a chance to see what he looks like and what I look like if you've only been following in audio. My parting thought today, it's a little bit of a stretch to try to figure out how I got there, but it's a little quote from Roald Dahl, who you may be familiar with that name, super famous. Here is the quote, and I'm not even going to try to explain it. I'm just going to leave it with you to contemplate. Here it is. And above all, watch with glittering eyes the whole world around you, because the greatest secrets are always hidden in the most unlikely places. Those who don't believe in magic will never find it. Please come back and join me in 2 weeks when my guest will be amazing artist and dear friend, Randy Lugana. Until then, I want to say thanks for listening. Come on back, and I will see you next time. Cool Gray in Studio A is a fine-tuned services production. It exists for entertainment purposes and is not intended to be used as a sole source of information or advice on any subject. Find and follow this podcast at coolgraystudios.com.